"Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before 150 service members marched through the doors of St. Michael's. The chart clattered against the tile floor of the ICU, its pages scattering like a broken wing. Hannah Clarke didn't flinch. She bent down, retrieved it, and continued her rounds as if he'd said nothing at all. Her hands were perfectly steady as she adjusted the 4-line on the patient in Bay 3, her movements precise and unhurried, while Dr. Caldwell watched from the nursing station with the satisfied smirk of a man who believed he'd just delivered a wound that would stay open. He had no idea what he was standing next to. Hannah had been working as a civilian nurse at St. Michael's for 3 months now, moving through the fluorescent-lit corridors of the trauma unit like she belonged there because she did, in a way that no credential could ever explain. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, the ventilator in Bay 2 wheezed its mechanical rhythm in the background, and somewhere down the hallway a heart monitor beeped with the steady patience of a metronome counting down someone's remaining hours. She moved between these sounds and smells with the kind of composure that came from having already survived the worst. Dr. Caldwell had arrived for his shift 3 months ago, the same week Hannah did, though their tenure stretched in opposite directions. 15 years at St. Michael's had built him into something he confused with authority, a man with board connections, medical school friends in high places, and an institutional protection that made him believe consequences were for other people. The first time he'd made a note about Hannah's competence, it had come wrapped in contempt. During morning rounds on her second week, she'd questioned his recommendation to delay drainage on a trauma patient with a pneumothorax. The patient's oxygen saturation was dropping. The decision made no clinical sense. With respect, Dr. Caldwell, the patient's O2 is 88 and falling. Standard protocol suggests. He'd cut her off with a smile that had teeth in it. "I've been practicing medicine since before you were born, Ms. Clarke. I don't need a floor nurse telling me how to read a patient." But he'd ordered the drainage 2 hours later. The patient stabilized. Hannah had said nothing about this, had simply charted the procedure with the same neutral precision she brought to every task. That silence, it seemed, had unnerved him more than any argument could have. Men like Caldwell didn't respect restraint. They saw it as weakness. The cafeteria tray incident happened on a Tuesday morning. Hannah had just finished a 12-hour shift, her scrubs damp from a patient's hemorrhage, her shoulders carrying the kind of fatigue that lived in the bone. She'd grabbed coffee and a sandwich in the break room, nothing fancy, just fuel for the drive home. She was walking past the nursing station when Dr. Caldwell was holding court with 3 junior residents, the kind of audience that made him brighten like a stage light had hit him. He announced the bet to everyone within earshot. "I give her a week. 1 week and she'll quit." "Who's taking the over?" Hannah had walked past without acknowledgement, her coffee cooling against her palm. The next day, he knocked the tray from her hands. She was standing at the counter, waiting for a colleague to finish printing charts. Caldwell came around the corner moving fast, his expression locked in a performance of casual indifference that fooled no one. His shoulder caught the edge of her tray. The collision wasn't accidental. The trajectory was too precise, the timing too deliberate. Food scattered across the tile floor, coffee spreading dark and wide, the sandwich breaking apart, apple slices rolling toward the trash bin like they were running from something. The room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant hum. A heart monitor beeped 3 times in the background. The ventilator wheezed. Everyone in the ICU had heard the crash and turned to watch what came next, waiting for the floor nurse to break, to cry, to retreat to a supply closet and compose herself. Hannah bent down. Her movements were methodical and controlled. She collected the scattered food with her bare hands, moving from left to right with the kind of systematic precision that suggested she was performing a surgical procedure rather than cleaning up debris. Not trembling. Not flushed. Not breathing hard. Her jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, a single muscle flexing beneath her skin, barely visible, and then it released. Dr. Caldwell watched her with the frustration of a man who'd expected a different response. He'd expected tears, maybe. Humiliation. An apology. Instead, she rose to her feet, disposed of the ruined lunch in the trash, and walked back to her patient assignments as if he'd said nothing. "I need some Jell-O," she said to the resident standing nearest to her. Her voice was even, almost light. "For Bay 4. And a fresh for kit. The one we opened has a kink." It wasn't a request. It was a command. That afternoon, during a quiet moment between patients, Hannah sat in the break room alone and reached into her scrub pocket. The tarnished military challenge coin was warm from her body heat, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, worn smooth from 15 years of nervous touches during dark operations and darker nights. The coin showed no official insignia anymore. The hammer and anvil design had been worn nearly flat. The edges were scarred from shrapnel. This coin had been forged in Kandahar from the wreckage of a helicopter that had gone down in Helmand province, hammered into shape by a sergeant whose name had been erased from official records the same day Hannah's had been. She didn't know why she carried it. Regulation would have called it a security risk. A reminder of a life that was supposed to be forgotten. But her hands moved to it every time the pressure built, every time she felt the weight of the life she'd lived bleeding through the boundaries of the civilian one she'd been ordered to assume. She traced the scarred edge with her thumb, breathing slow and measured, and thought about Dr. Caldwell's smirk. There were worse things than being underestimated. At 2:14 p.m., the radio crackled. Code red. Trauma incoming. Single male, 28 years old, presenting with penetrating thoracic wound and possible cardiac involvement. ETA for minutes. The ICU transformed instantly. The quiet that had settled over the afternoon evaporated. Nurses moved toward the trauma bay with the choreography of people who had done this 1,000 times. Dr. Caldwell was already moving, already barking orders about getting the surgical suite ready, about calling the attending cardiologist, about preparing for possible pericardiocentesis if they found fluid around the heart. His voice carried the confidence of a man in control, and for a moment it seemed like the organized chaos of the emergency might actually work the way it was supposed to. The ambulance doors opened and the patient came through like a storm. The paramedics were moving fast, their voices overlapping with practiced efficiency. Trauma alert. GSW to the left anterior chest. Lost consciousness at scene. Regained it in ambulance. Breathing shallow. Heart rate 142, blood pressure 76/52 and dropping. Oxygen saturation 71%. They'd gotten an 18-gauge line in the left arm. They'd done what they could in a metal box moving 75 miles per hour through San Antonio traffic, and now the patient was being transferred to the hospital bed and Hannah was there, already reading the monitors, already assessing, already seeing what the numbers weren't quite saying out loud yet. The patient was in shock. Deep shock. His skin was the color of wet concrete, his pupils dilated, his breathing quick and shallow like he was trying to sip oxygen through a cocktail straw. The wound on his chest was small. That was always the terrible part about gunshot wounds, how small they looked from the outside, but the bullet had gone in deep, had tumbled through tissue and organs and ribs, and something inside him was bleeding into spaces where blood wasn't supposed to be. Dr. Caldwell moved to the head of the bed, assuming his position as captain of this ship, and Hannah positioned herself on the right side of the patient's chest where she could monitor the heart rhythm and maintain access to the medication ports. The attending cardiologist was 3 minutes out. The surgical team was being paged. There was a plan, and the plan was to stabilize the patient until they could get him to the operating room where the real work could begin. But then the patient's oxygen saturation dropped to 62. The monitor showed it happening in real time, the numbers falling like a stone down a well. 71, then 68, then 62, and the beeping was getting faster, more insistent, the kind of sound that made every person in the room understand that the narrow window for getting this right was closing. Dr. Caldwell reached for the endotracheal tube to intubate, his movement suddenly less certain, his voice slightly sharper when he called for the size for .0 pediatric tube and the suction and the laryngoscope. Hannah was already moving. She didn't call out. She didn't ask permission. Her hands moved on their own, steadying the patient's head with the kind of precision that suggested she'd done this 10,000 times, her fingers positioning the neck at exactly the right angle to open the airway, her movements flowing into the next movement like water finding its level. The tube went in smooth and clean. The ventilator hissed its first breath into the patient's lungs, and the oxygen saturation climbed. 65, 72. 79, 84. Stabilizing. Dr. Caldwell was staring at her. Not with gratitude. Not with professional acknowledgement. With something that looked like confusion, like he was seeing something he couldn't quite categorize. Hannah's hands were moving again, this time to the patient's chest, to the small wound that was the entry point for all this chaos. The bullet had gone in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and she was palpating around it with a kind of careful assessment that suggested she was reading a language written in tissue and blood. The patient's heart rate was 158 now. His blood pressure was climbing slightly but still dangerously low at 82/48. The JVD, jugular venous distension, was visible on both sides, which meant increased pressure in the chest cavity, which meant the pericardium was probably filling with blood. "We need pericardiocentesis," Hannah said quietly. Her voice had dropped an octave from what it usually was. She wasn't asking. She wasn't suggesting. He's got a tension physiology. The bullet's in the pericardial sac. Dr. Caldwell opened his mouth to respond, but the cardiologist was already there, already looking at the monitors, already making the same assessment. "She's right. Get me an 18-gauge needle on a 50 cubic centimeter syringe. We're doing it now. Stand by for subxiphoid approach." Hannah prepared the field with rapid efficiency, cleansing the skin with antiseptic that smelled sharp and metallic, laying out the sterile drapes, positioning the overhead light. The cardiologist guided the needle in with a kind of careful precision that spoke to years of practice, angling up toward the heart, feeling for the resistance that would mean he'd breached the pericardium. When the needle entered the fluid, the syringe filled dark and fast, blood. A lot of blood. Too much blood. But as the pressure released, as the blood drained, the patient's oxygen saturation improved. His heart rate came down. His blood pressure climbed. The numbers on the monitor shifted from the red zone toward something that looked more like life. It was then that Hannah moved to close the entrance wound, to clean the area, to prepare the patient for surgery. And it was then that she reached for the suture material with the kind of certainty that made the cardiologist pause and watch her hands. She tied the first layer with a three-point closure technique, the knot small and perfect and precise, the spacing exactly right, the tension on the thread neither too tight nor too loose. It was surgical technique. It was military surgical technique. It was the kind of technique that was taught in forward surgical teams operating in tents in Helmand Province, the kind of closure that held when helicopters were landing in dust storms and plasma was running through 4 lines and the nearest operating room was 5 hours away by air. The Navy SEAL's eyes were open. He'd regained consciousness during the intubation, and now he was lying there with the tube in his throat and the monitors beeping around him, and he was watching Hannah's hands. His eyes tracked the movement of the suture, the placement of the knots, the way her fingers moved like she was playing an instrument only she could hear. And something shifted in his expression. Something recognizing something. His heart rate picked up again. Not from the pain or the shock or the trauma. From recognition. Hannah finished the closure with the kind of calm that suggested she'd done this before, in places where the mortality rate was measured in single percentages and the cost of failure was measured in flag-draped boxes. She stepped back from the bed, her work complete, her hand steady, her expression revealing nothing. But the SEAL's eyes never left her face. The cardiologist was already on his phone with the surgical team, already calling for transport to the OR, already setting the next phase of this emergency in motion. The nurses were moving again, adjusting lines, changing medications, preparing for the move upstairs. Everything was momentum and urgency and the organized chaos of people who understood that this patient had approximately 90 minutes before the damage from blood loss became irreversible. In all of that movement, in all of that noise, the Navy SEAL kept his eyes locked on Hannah Clarke's face. His jaw tightened. His hand moved slightly on the bed, a gesture that might have been reaching, might have been attempting to communicate something that his intubated throat would never let him say. He knew exactly who she was. The recognition in the SEAL's eyes was immediate. Unmistakable. Hannah's hands froze for exactly half a second that felt like free fall, before muscle memory took over. 3-layer combat closure. The technique she had taught to forward surgical teams in the Helmand province, the one that stopped hemorrhage in forward operating bases where a surgeon might not arrive for hours. Her fingers resumed their rhythm. Suture. Tension. Knot. The SEAL's lips moved. Helmand. You taught Charlie Med. His words were barely a whisper beneath the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, but they landed like shrapnel in her chest. Hannah kept working. Her hands were steady. Perfectly steady. But her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she completed the final suture and stepped back from the table, the tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Reaper, the SEAL murmured as consciousness slipped away from him again, the name dissolving into sedation like mist. Dr. Caldwell was already moving toward the trauma notes, dictating post-operative orders to one of the residents, completely oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in the room. He hadn't heard. The monitoring equipment, the hiss of oxygen, the ventilator's rhythmic breathing, they had swallowed the word whole. But Hannah had heard it. She had heard it the way a predator hears a whistle pitched at frequencies the human ear shouldn't detect. The civilian cover she had constructed so carefully over the past 3 months, the one the military had spent months building with fabricated references and a false nursing school diploma, had just developed a hairline fracture. But that wasn't even the worst part. What Dr. Caldwell didn't know was that Hannah had deliberately maneuvered herself onto the SEAL's recovery team. The request had been casual, almost thoughtless. She'd mentioned it to the charge nurse as they reviewed post-op assignments. I'll take ICU recovery for the chest wound case, she'd said. I've worked thoracic complications before. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would have raised suspicion. Nothing that would have suggested she was walking directly toward the person who could expose her in a single word to anyone with clearance. The ICU bay was on the 3rd floor, the corner room with the windows overlooking the parking lot where a convoy of military vehicles would eventually assemble, though Hannah didn't know that yet. What she did know was that she had 6 hours, maybe less, before this SEAL regained consciousness. 6 hours before he could say her name again. 6 hours before the entire carefully constructed fiction of Hannah Clarke, civilian trauma nurse from Austin, Texas, collapsed like a house built on wet sand. She changed into fresh scrubs in the locker room and stared at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. The woman looking back at her was composed. Controlled. Not a single strand of hair out of place. Not a tremor in her jaw. She gripped the cool porcelain edge of the sink and pressed her forehead against the mirror for 3 seconds, breathing through her nose, the way she had been trained to do in situations where the situation couldn't be fixed, only managed. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs. When she emerged from the locker room, Dr. Caldwell was waiting in the hallway with 2 residents in tow. He had that particular expression on his face, the one that meant he had spent the last 10 minutes building up a performance, the kind of display that required an audience to appreciate properly. The residents flanked him like remoras following a shark, and Hannah recognized the setup immediately. She had seen it twice already in her 3 months at St. Michael's. "Ah, Clarke," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of a heating element that only worked on its highest setting. "I wanted to discuss your post-op assessment of the thoracic case." "Charts current, Doctor," Hannah said, keeping her voice level, professional. "All vitals are stable. Patient is sedated and recovering normally." "That's the thing," Caldwell said, and he stepped closer, invading the space she maintained the way a predator tests the boundaries of prey. "Your assessment might be premature. The patient's output seems irregular. I'm concerned you may have missed something during your initial evaluation." He turned to the residents with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. This is what happens when nurses with less experience are assigned to critical cases. They miss the details. They panic. Hannah felt the weight of his words like pressure in water. She had seen Navy SEALs recover from worse injuries in desert forward operating bases with nothing but a combat medic and morphine. She had watched a woman with blast injuries across 70% of her body survive 3 weeks with subcutaneous fluid resuscitation and prayer. Her seal was healthy. His vitals were textbook. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Dr. Caldwell was establishing a narrative, building a case, the same way he had built every other moment of humiliation over the past 72 hours. The previous morning, he had knocked her cafeteria tray off the table with his elbow as he walked past, coffee spreading across the tile like spilled blood while 24 staff members pretended not to notice. She had knelt down, cleaned every fragment of ceramic, every piece of food, every drop of liquid, and stood again with the tray in her hands and her face perfectly neutral. A nurse from pediatrics had whispered something to another nurse. Both had looked away when Hannah glanced up. The day before that, he had made his announcement during shift change, standing in the middle of the ER with his hands on his hips like a general commanding troops. "I give the new girl 1 week before she quits," he had said, loudly enough that the entire staff could hear. "Anyone want to take that bet? I'm serious. Fresh meat never lasts in trauma. They see 1 or 2 codes and they're writing their resignation letter." Several nurses had looked at Hannah. One had seemed sympathetic. Most had just looked embarrassed, the way people do when they witness cruelty and lack the courage to interrupt it. Hannah had continued reviewing her patient charts without looking up, her pen steady in her hand, making notations in blue ink. Her jaw had tightened. Just the muscles. Just for a fraction of a second. Then she had controlled it the way you control anything dangerous, through discipline. Now, standing in the hallway with Dr. Caldwell's voice wrapped around her like wire, she maintained her composure the same way. "I'll recheck the patient's output, doctor," she said. "With permission, I can perform a point-of-care ultrasound on the pericardium to rule out accumulation." Caldwell's smile widened. He had been expecting her to argue, or to become defensive, or to offer the kind of excuses that gave him more material to work with. Instead, Hannah had offered him exactly what he asked for: compliance, competence, and the absence of emotional response. It frustrated him. She could see it in the tightness around his mouth, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He wanted a reaction. He was collecting them, saving them up for something. "Do that," he said finally. "And next time, don't miss critical details in the first place." He turned and walked away, the residents trailing behind him like pilot fish following a larger predator. Hannah stood in the hallway for 1 moment, just one, and let her hand rest against the wall. Cold. Smooth. Real. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs, a weight she had carried for 15 years, through 3 tours of Helm and Province, through the operation that had gone sideways, through the classified briefing where a general had told her that her records were being erased and her military identity was being deleted as of 0400 hours the following morning. "Disappear into civilian life," they had said. "Your country needs you to vanish." She had done exactly as ordered. She had learned to be Hannah Clarke. She had learned to bend down and pick up spilled trays without comment. She had learned to accept public humiliation with the kind of grace that only comes from having already survived the worst kinds of loss. She had learned to make her hand steady even when her jaw wanted to scream. But the seal upstairs had recognized her. And in 6 hours, he would wake up and say her name again. And the entire careful architecture of her disappeared identity would become irrelevant. Hannah pushed off from the wall and walked toward the elevator, her steps measured and precise, each one falling like a heartbeat on the polished hospital floor. The elevator door slid open with a whisper of pneumatic air, and she stepped inside, pressing the button for the 3rd floor. The doors closed. The cables groaned as the elevator began to rise, carrying her toward the ICU, toward the patient who had already seen through her, toward the clock that was running down on her remaining time as someone no one knew. She reached into her pocket and felt the tarnished coin beneath her fingertips. Still there. Still real. Still a memory of everything she had been before she learned how to disappear. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the 3rd floor. The door slid open. Hannah stepped out into the ICU corridor and walked toward the corner room, where a Navy SEAL was sleeping off anesthesia and waiting to change her life again with a single word. The corner ICU room was quiet except for the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze. Hannah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the monitor leads, verifying the fluid bag hanging from the triple-lumen central line, noting the SEAL's stable vitals on the computer screen. His chest rose and fell. Oxygen saturation holding at 94%. Blood pressure 120/78. His eyes were still closed from the anesthesia, but his jaw was tight. Even sedated, this man carried the weight of command. She was adjusting the cardiac monitoring electrode when his hand moved. Not much. Just a fraction of an inch, fingers twitching. His eyes opened. Unfocused at first, then clearing with the terrible speed of a trained operative waking in an unfamiliar room. His gaze found hers, and for exactly 2 seconds, there was nothing but recognition. "Reaper," he whispered. Not a question. A confirmation. Hannah's hand stilled. She didn't look away. She didn't change her breathing. She simply finished securing the monitor lead and stepped back to the medication cart with the same measured pace she'd maintained all morning. The SEAL's eyes closed again, satisfied. He knew. She knew he knew. And now, she had a problem. The ICU charge nurse, Patricia, was standing at the station reviewing charts when the phone on the desk rang. Patricia answered, listened, and Hannah watched her expression shift from neutral to uncomfortable. "Yes, Dr. Caldwell. I understand. Right away." She hung up and didn't look at Hannah directly. That was the tell. That was the moment everything changed. "Hannah, can you come here for a minute?" Patricia's voice had the careful neutrality of someone caught between institutional power and personal decency. Hannah walked over. Patricia slid a printed memo across the desk. Reassignment notice. Effective immediately. Hannah Clarke was being transferred to the medical surgical floor, post-operative recovery, day shift only. The reason cited, inappropriate patient attachment and concerns regarding protocol adherence. Hannah read it once. Read it again. The words were arranged in a sequence that made medical sense only if you didn't understand medicine. Inappropriate patient attachment. The phrase was designed to sound professional while meaning nothing. A SEAL in ICU recovery required continuous monitoring from experienced trauma nurses. You couldn't reassign that care to a medical surgical floor without risk of missed complications. This came from Dr. Caldwell. Hannah asked. Patricia nodded, still not meeting her eyes. He called about 15 minutes ago. Said there were some concerns about your chart documentation on the SEAL's case. Said he wanted to ensure continuity of care with a more senior staff member. Patricia's jaw tightened slightly. She knew. Everyone knew. Caldwell was protecting territory, and he was using the system to do it. Who's taking over his care? Hannah kept her voice level, professional, the way a nurse speaks when asking a clinical question about a patient's treatment plan. Dr. Caldwell is assigning himself as primary. Margaret will be the day shift ICU nurse, but he wants to oversee everything personally. Patricia finally looked up. There was apology in her eyes, but also powerlessness. "I'm sorry, Hannah. It came from above my head." Hannah folded the reassignment notice and slipped it into her scrub pocket next to the tarnished challenge coin. The metal was cool against her palm, a small anchor to something true beneath the institutional fiction. She'd survived 3 deployments to Helmand Province, survived the classified operation that still didn't exist in any official record, survived 15 years of work that would never appear on a resume. She could survive a reassignment notice. But that wasn't the point. The SEAL would not survive Dr. Caldwell's care, and they both knew it. She checked her watch. 11:47 a.m. She had until noon, when the shift change would lock her out of ICU access. She moved toward the SEAL's room, but Patricia's voice stopped her. "Hannah, I can't let you go in there without authorization. You know the new protocol he put in place." Patricia's voice was thick with shame. He said no unsupervised access to that room except for assigned ICU staff and physicians. The words landed like a physical blow, but Hannah's expression didn't change. She simply nodded, turned back to the station, and began gathering her things from the day-shift locker. She'd been in worse positions. She'd been in rooms where the enemy controlled every exit, every communication channel, every supply line. This was just a hospital. This was just bureaucracy. This was just a scared doctor trying to consolidate power. But the SEAL's recovery protocol had 3 significant errors. Hannah had spotted them during the initial assessment: medication interactions that wouldn't show up for 48 hours, a fluid calculation that didn't account for his specific injury pattern, and a missed notation about his allergy to cephalosporins. Dr. Caldwell wouldn't catch those. Caldwell operated on authority, not precision. Authority was faster. Authority didn't require you to read the chart 3 times or think through complications that contradicted your first impression. The SEAL would deteriorate in 36 to 48 hours. Hannah could predict it with the certainty of someone who'd managed trauma in field hospitals where the margin between life and death was measured in minutes. Cardiac arrhythmia secondary to electrolyte imbalance. A fever that would mask the real infection, the subtle indication of sepsis creeping through his bloodstream. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the window for intervention would be closing. She clocked out at exactly noon. The parking garage smelled like hot asphalt and diesel exhaust, the San Antonio afternoon settling into that brutal heat that made the concrete shimmer. She sat in her car, a 7-year-old Honda Accord, nothing that would draw attention, and placed the tarnished challenge coin on the steering wheel. The metal caught the light coming through the windshield. Dented from impact. Scarred from shrapnel. The coin had come through Helmand Province, through a forward surgical team operating on a concrete floor lit by chemical lights, through an evacuation that was never supposed to happen and a life that was supposed to disappear completely into civilian authenticity. The phone on her lap buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "Welcome to St. Michael's family, Hannah. If you ever need anything, I'm here for you. Patricia." Not protocol. Not official. Just one nurse recognizing another nurse caught in the machinery of institutional power. Hannah set the coin back in her pocket and started the engine. She had 4 hours before the night shift began, before the SEAL's recovery truly began, before the errors in his protocol would start their slow work toward failure. She needed to think. She needed to consider every angle of what Caldwell was actually doing. 2 hours after the reassignment notice, while Hannah was driving through San Antonio traffic toward her apartment, Dr. Caldwell was making calls. 3 of them, each to a board member who owed him referrals, consulting opportunities, the kind of professional capital that came from protecting allies. The first call lasted 9 minutes. The second lasted 6. By the third call, he'd established a paper trail. Some concerns about Ms. Clarke's documentation practices. Not quite the standard we maintain at St. Michael's. I want to ensure we're protecting ourselves legally. The board members didn't ask questions. They understood the language. Protect the institution. Protect the physician. Isolate the liability. That evening, one of those board members, Gerald Hayes, who served on Credentials Committee and had 3 consulting contracts that ran through Caldwell's department, made a call to a nursing school in Dallas. A routine inquiry, he said. Just verifying some employment history for an internal review. The nursing school checked their records. Hannah Clarke had graduated in the year specified on her resume. But when they pulled her transcript, something was off. The dates didn't align perfectly with the programs listed. There was a 6-month gap that the resume didn't account for. It was tiny. It was nothing. It was exactly the kind of discrepancy that would look suspicious if someone was looking for suspicion. Hayes made another call, this one to a hospital in Fort Worth where Hannah had claimed 6 months of contract work. That position had existed. But the administrator who'd supervised it had retired 3 years ago. The current HR director couldn't find original employment paperwork. Everything was archived, digitized imperfectly, scattered across systems that didn't talk to each other. But the absence of documentation was itself documentation. It was a gap. It was a question mark. By 5 p.m., Dr. Caldwell had 4 separate people examining Hannah's credentials with the kind of focused attention that always finds something wrong if the person looking is determined to find it. He hadn't outright lied. He'd simply pointed out concerns. He'd simply asked questions. And in doing so, he'd activated a network of professional relationships built over 2 decades of careful alliance building, favors distributed like currency, obligations accumulated and called in. Hannah sat in her apartment, a small 1-bedroom in a development that changed hands often, where no one knew anyone and privacy was the default, and stared at nothing. The tarnished challenge coin sat on the kitchen table. Around it, the artifacts of her constructed life, a Texas nursing license with her photograph and a name that was real but would never appear on any military record. A social security number that actually worked. A bank account that showed regular deposits from St. Michael's, nothing that would raise flags. Everything real enough to pass inspection if no one was looking too hard. But someone was looking. She understood what Caldwell was doing. He wasn't trying to destroy her. He was trying to build a case. Reassignment based on patient attachment was the opening move. The credential questions were the follow-up. Within 2 weeks, he'd have documented concerns about her competence, institutional worry about her background, and enough paper to justify termination with cause. No severance. No grace. No explanation that protected her from future employers. Just a quiet removal, the kind that left a stain on any resume it touched. He didn't know who she was. But he was smart enough to know something about her didn't add up. And he was using the system to force it out into the light. Hannah stood and walked to the window. San Antonio sprawled below her, lights coming on as the sun descended toward the horizon. Somewhere in that city, in the ICU at St. Michael's, a Navy SEAL was waking from anesthesia in a recovery protocol that would kill him within 48 hours. Dr. Caldwell would be reviewing charts, satisfied that he'd removed the threat to his authority. Hannah would be reassigned to a different floor, her credentials under examination, her cover story unraveling like pulled thread. She made her decision. She would go to the hospital tomorrow. She would access that ICU room. She would fix the protocol errors, and she would document exactly what she'd corrected and why. If Caldwell wanted to build a case against her, she would build one against him, not through institutional channels, not through board members and professional favors, but through documented medical fact. The SEAL's recovery depended on accuracy. Everything else was secondary. The night shift at St. Michael's had its own rhythm, slower than daylight hours but no less dangerous. Monitors hummed their constant surveillance songs, ventilators wheezed their mechanical breath, and the ICU held its quiet vigil over the dying and the barely saved. Hannah moved through the unit at 2:31 a.m., checking 4 lines, adjusting sedation drips, her movements economical and precise. She'd been banned from the SEAL's room since Dr. Caldwell's morning call to administration, her name flagged in the system with a simple note, restricted access per Dr. Caldwell's request. It was the kind of institutional barrier that felt insurmountable to most people. Hannah had spent 15 years moving through barriers that didn't officially exist. The colleague she needed was already expecting her. Maria worked respiratory therapy and owed Hannah a favor from 3 months back when Hannah had caught a medication error before it became fatal. Maria's badge had full ICU access. She handed it over without a word, their eyes meeting for exactly 1 second, the kind of professional understanding that transcends explanation. "If anyone asks," Maria said, "you never saw me." Hannah slipped the badge into her scrub pocket alongside the tarnished challenge coin she carried everywhere, the weight of both objects grounding her to some version of herself that felt increasingly impossible to hide. She waited until 2:41 a.m. The night shift nurse covering the SEAL's room stepped out for a bathroom break, and Hannah moved. The badge slid against the reader with a soft electronic chirp. The door clicked open. Inside, the room smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of a closed space where a sedated body lay breathing through mechanical assistance. The SEAL lay in bed 12, his chest wrapped in surgical dressings, his recovery line sitting at the bottom of the steep cliff between living and the alternative. Hannah's eyes found the chart immediately. The pain protocol was wrong. The antibiotics were on schedule, yes, but the pericardiocentesis order that should have been written to drain the residual fluid building around his heart was missing. Missing. 3 days post-op and no one had ordered the drainage. Another 72 hours at this rate and the fluid would compress his heart, restrict its filling, and he'd go into cardiogenic shock while lying in his own bed. She was writing the order, her handwriting steady as surgical steel, when the ICU doors exploded inward. The sound came first, not a gunshot, not yet, but the crash of security doors being shouldered open by a force they weren't designed to resist. Boot steps. Running. Angry. A man's voice, hoarse with rage and fresh grief. Where is he? Where's the man in 12? The night nurse was shouting something, trying to block the hallway, her voice high and panicked. Sir, you can't be back here, sir. Hannah recognized the tone before she heard the gunshot. That particular edge in a person's voice when they've already decided on violence, when asking a question was just a formality before the answer came in bullets. She'd heard that tone in Helmand Province during a mortar attack on a forward operating base. She'd heard it in the eyes of an insurgent who'd breached the surgical tent. The body knew what the mind was still processing. Muscle memory didn't require conscious thought. She was already moving toward the door when she saw him. 6'2", maybe 230 pounds, built like someone who'd grown up doing physical work. His shirt was torn. His face was streaked with the kind of tears that come from having held someone while they died. The weapon in his hands was a Glock 19, and his hands were shaking, the wrong kind of shaking, not fear but adrenaline mixed with the particular madness that grief creates in a split second. His eye scanned the room and found the SEAL's bed. That's him. That's the murderer. Hannah stepped sideways. Not away from the SEAL. Between him and the gunman. Her hands came up slowly, palms forward, the universal language of surrender that she had no intention of honoring. Her voice dropped into the register she used in surgery, calm, authoritative, the kind of voice that made people listen even when they didn't want to. You don't want to do this. My brother, he said. His voice cracked on the second word. They told me he shot my brother. Said they were defending themselves, but it was an execution. An execution. The gun came up. His eyes were somewhere else, focused on a memory instead of the room in front of him. Hannah had about 2 seconds before his finger tightened. Your brother made a choice, she said. This man didn't make it for him. Killing him won't change what already happened. You don't know anything about what happened. No, Hannah agreed. I don't. But I know he's sedated. He can't defend himself. And I know that if you pull that trigger, what you'll have done is committed murder. Not justice. Murder. Your brother's dead because someone made a choice. Now you're about to make the same one. His hand steadied. That was the problem. The shaking stopped. The madness found focus. Hannah watched it happen in real time, saw the moment the grief converted into something with direction. The gun steadied on the SEAL's chest, and Hannah realized she'd failed at the conversation. The conversation had been the delay tactic all along, and it hadn't worked. She moved. Not toward the gun. Not toward the man. Toward the space between them. Physics would do the rest. The first round caught her center mass. She felt it before she heard it, the impact like a sledgehammer wrapped in fire. The sound came second, a crack like breaking bone, loud enough to echo off the ICU walls and trigger every alarm in the unit simultaneously. Her breath left her body in an involuntary gasp. The second round came while she was still processing the first, and it hit her again, 2 inches to the right of the first wound. The burning spread like someone had poured gasoline into her chest and lit it on fire. The third shot tore through her shoulder, and that one made her drop. Gravity was suddenly very real and very interested. The fourth round caught her in the abdomen as she fell, and the fifth came through her thigh, and somewhere in the chaos of impact and pain and the singular clarity that comes from being shot, Hannah realized she was probably dying. The pain wasn't sharp anymore, it was everything, a complete rewriting of what her body was in terms of damage and consequence. The gunman was still firing. Or trying to. Hospital security had breached the room from the east entrance, a guard named Reeves who'd served 2 years in the Army Reserve before his hearing went bad. He moved like someone who'd trained for exactly this scenario, and his movement trajectory said he was going to intercept before the magazine could cycle again. The 6th shot never came. The weapon came up, the guard came forward, and the next sound was the distinctive crack of a strike baton connecting with a wrist holding a gun. The weapon fell. The man fell. Reeves was calling for additional support, and another guard was already on scene, and the SEAL's room became something other than an ICU room, it became a crime scene. Hannah's vision had tunnel vision now. The edges of the room were getting dark. She became aware of other sensations, the sticky warmth spreading across her scrubs, the smell of copper and something burnt, the sound of the heart monitor still faithfully recording the SEAL's stable rhythm even as her own monitor was screaming numbers that meant dying. Someone was applying pressure to her chest. Maria was there. Maria was saying something, and her voice sounded like she was underwater. The ceiling light was very bright, and then it wasn't, and then she was on a stretcher, and the movement made everything worse, and she remembered the tarnished challenge coin in her pocket and wondered if it was still there or if it had fallen out when she'd fallen. The last thing she saw before they took her to the OR was the coin on the floor, 3 feet from her blood trail, tarnished silver catching the fluorescent light like an eye watching everything that came next. The surgery took 4 hours. 2 of those were spent finding and controlling bleeding points. 1 was spent repairing the penetrating wound to her abdomen where the 4th bullet had caught the peritoneum. The final hour was damage control and closure, the surgical decision to put her together well enough to live, to fight infection and shock later if she made it through the first 72 hours. When she woke 3 days later in the ICU, not as a nurse now but as a patient, the first thing she noticed was that she was breathing on her own. The second thing she noticed was the envelope on the bedside table. The envelope had her name on it. It was from administration. She was placed on permanent leave, effective immediately, pending a formal disciplinary review. The official charges were unauthorized security intervention and reckless endangerment of hospital operations. Dr. Caldwell had already initiated contact with her fabricated nursing school in Denver, the one that didn't exist, the one that the military had created 18 months ago when they decided to erase Hannah and rebuild her as a civilian. He'd contacted 3 references who were actually military intelligence officers rotating through cover jobs. He'd written to the nursing board with questions about credential verification. He'd done everything correctly according to the institutional playbook of how to dismantle someone's professional life. What he didn't understand was that Hannah's professional life wasn't her real one anyway. 2 weeks later, she sat in a diner on the edge of San Antonio, the kind of place that stayed open at 3 in the morning for people who had nowhere else to be. The coffee was cold. The window was fogged with the breath of a dozen other lonely people, and Hannah stared at her reflection, hollow-eyed, scarred, fading back into the invisibility she'd spent 15 years perfecting. Outside, headlights passed on the highway. Each one was someone going somewhere, connected to something, part of the world that didn't require you to disappear to survive. She thought about the SEAL in bed 12. She thought about whether her intervention had saved him or just delayed what was coming. She thought about the institutional machinery that had decided she was expendable, that her sacrifice meant nothing because her existence meant nothing. Not officially. Not on any record that mattered. She didn't know that the SEAL had woken up that morning. She didn't know that his first action, with an IV still in his arm and surgical dressing still on his chest, had been to tell the night shift nurse that he needed to speak to his commanding officer. She didn't know that a phone call had been made, and then another, and then a series of calls that spiraled upward through a chain of command that existed in the space between classified and real. She didn't know that exactly 5 hours after she'd been shot, while she was still on an operating table having her body reassembled, a decision had been made in an office with no official address to send a message to St. Michael's Hospital that said, in effect, Hannah Clarke belongs to us now. Exactly 5 hours after Hannah Clarke's body had been reassembled on an operating table at St. Michael's, while surgical lights still cast their white glare across her sutured chest and abdomen, a convoy of 15 military vehicles turned onto Fredericksburg Road and began moving toward the hospital's main entrance with the deliberate precision of something that did not acknowledge traffic laws or civilian speed limits. The lead vehicle was a Black Hawk with its doors removed, and behind it rolled Hums in formation, their painted insignia catching the early evening light like teeth. Boots began hitting the pavement before the engines had fully died. 150 service members in full dress blues moved through the main doors of St. Michael's Hospital in a single organized column, their uniforms so perfectly pressed they seemed to cast shadows of their own, and the hospital security guard, himself a Marine veteran who'd done 2 tours in Fallujah, watched them flow past his checkpoint with the understanding that nobody was asking permission. The lead officer, a man whose chest carried enough medals to constitute an actual threat, approached the intake desk with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to him. When he spoke, his voice carried the texture of a tank idling in a garage. "I need to see Reaper." The words landed like a defibrillator shock. The intake nurse, who had been processing insurance forms for a man with kidney stones, looked up at this officer whose eyes held the exact color of storm-threatened Atlantic water and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The security guard, the one who'd carried a buddy out of Ramadi with shrapnel still embedded in his own shoulder, moved to the desk and checked the patient roster with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding of who lay in ICU bed 7. "Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke is in ICU," he announced over the intercom, and the words echoed through corridors where she had walked for 3 months being called just a nurse, and something shifted in the building's foundation. Within 4 minutes, a 2-star admiral, the kind of presence that made hospital administrators suddenly remember how to stand at attention, was standing in Dr. Caldwell's office with Hannah's complete military record open in his hands like an indictment. The admiral began reading aloud with the deliberate pacing of someone ensuring every word took root. "Bronze Star with Valor. Another Bronze Star with Valor. 3 Silver Stars. 2 Purple Hearts. 15 years of classified surgical operations in Helmand Province, Kandahar, Kuna Valley, the names of places where American soldiers had bled and Hannah Clarke's hands had held them together." The room fell absolutely silent for 10 seconds that stretched like broken glass. Dr. Caldwell's face drained of color the way a transfusion bag empties, and his jaw began working without sound, like a fish in stagnant water. The admiral's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Your personnel file indicates you questioned Master Chief Clarke's nursing credentials and initiated a termination investigation 4 hours after she was shot protecting a SEAL under your care. Did I read that correctly, Doctor?" The words landed with the weight of inevitability. What happened in the next 11 hours didn't just change St. Michael's Hospital. It detonated it. A video of Dr. Caldwell throwing the patient chart at Hannah's feet, recorded by a young resident with a military family, had been uploaded to social media while Hannah was still in post-op recovery, tagged and retagged and shared across platforms until it reached 2 million views by midnight. The comment section filled with service members verifying her rank, with former Helmand Province surgical teams confirming her identity, with people who had been held together on operating tables by her hands now telling the world what they knew. By the next morning, someone had tagged Dr. Raymond Mitchell, Hannah's surgical mentor from her uniformed services university days, a retired Navy surgeon who had spent 30 years training the generation of military physicians who would deploy into the world's worst places. Mitchell's public letter was posted at 6:53 a.m. on a Thursday, and it spread through medical circles like a contagion. "The man in the video is no colleague of mine," Mitchell wrote, his words precise as scalpel cuts. "The physician who disgraced a decorated Master Chief Petty Officer while she bled out protecting his patient represents everything that fails when power is mistaken for competence. He is not a student of medicine. He is a student of self-preservation. And I will not watch in silence as he hides behind institutional protection." The letter was reprinted in JAMA, shared in medical school ethics seminars, and attached to 3 separate board review notifications that landed in Dr. Caldwell's inbox by Friday morning. His medical school connections, the ones he'd cultivated through committee work and country club lunches for 15 years, stopped returning his calls. His wife, who had believed his version of events for exactly 6 hours before seeing the video, moved to her sister's house in Austin. The hospital's legal team, realizing the extinction-level liability of having terminated a combat-decorated veteran immediately after she was shot protecting a patient in their facility, expedited a review that would take most cases 18 months to complete. The summary took 4 days. Hannah's termination was reversed with full back pay and a formal apology. The hospital launched an investigation into Dr. Caldwell's conduct that documented the cafeteria incident, the public betting announcement during shift change, the reassignment of her from the SEAL's care, and 17 separate emails in which he referred to her as that problem nurse in conversations with board members he thought would protect him. Except institutional protection, as it turned out, only worked when the institution still wanted you protected. Witnesses began surfacing on day 6. A respiratory therapist described watching Dr. Caldwell knock the tray from Hannah's hands. A third-year resident detailed the chart incident in a formal deposition. A nurse manager produced documentation of the ICU reassignment alongside timestamps proving it was deliberately timed before the SEAL's critical window. By day 8, the state medical board had suspended his license pending ethics review. By day 11, his practice had dissolved. Colleagues who had laughed at his jokes in the physician's lounge now avoided eye contact in hallways, suddenly remembering their own careers, their own families, their own futures. The network he had spent 15 years building collapsed in 11 days like a building made of business cards. His mentor's disavowal was reprinted in medical ethics journals as a case study in how institutional rot spreads when good people don't stand their ground. Dr. Caldwell sat in his empty office on day 12, staring at the commendations on his wall, and understood with absolute clarity that power isn't a title, power is the ability to help, and once you've lost that, the title becomes an anchor. 6 months later, Dr. Caldwell sat at a folding table in a strip mall parking lot in suburban San Antonio, between a tax preparation service and a place that sold phone chargers, selling supplemental insurance policies to people who avoided eye contact and never asked for his name. His hands, which had once written prescriptions with the certainty of someone unchallengeable, now held brochures about coverage gaps and premium structures. The fluorescent lights of his temporary office flickered like they were questioning his presence there. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, Hannah Clarke stood on a stage in her Master Chief dress blues, the uniform she had earned through 15 years of classified operations and 2 tours through the corridors of hell, and accepted the position of Chief of Trauma Surgery for the entire VA hospital system. 150 service members stood in formation, and as she approached the podium, they moved in synchronized silence, a wave of dress uniforms that seemed to part the very air. The Navy SEAL she had saved, the one who had recognized her surgical technique in that operating room 3 months ago, stood at attention in the front row, his chest now rising and falling with lungs that had nearly failed, his body whole because she had bled out protecting him. Salutes came like a synchronized prayer. The sound was like thunder contained in a room, the impact of individual hands raising to foreheads in unison, and Hannah's eyes, which had watched men and women die in Helmand Province, which had remained steady while bullets tore through her own body, reflected the moment back to them with a calm that moved people to tears. 3 weeks later, in her new office on the 7th floor of the Eisenhower VA Medical Center, Hannah stood at the desk and opened the glass case that held her tarnished military challenge coin, the coin she had carried in her scrub pocket through 3 months of humiliation and 1 night of violence. The coin was polished now, its surface restored to a mirror shine that reflected the light like a small sun. Beside it lay a photograph from Helmand Province, a surgical team captured in a moment between operations, their faces young and hard and alive, people she could finally acknowledge again. Names she could speak aloud. Memories she didn't have to hide. A nurse knocked on the office door at 4 in the afternoon, hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to be there. She was young, maybe 2 years into her career, and her eyes carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been systematically disrespected by someone with power. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the nurse said. "One of the attending physicians has been." She trailed off, uncertain. Hannah's eyes met hers with perfect recognition. "He's been making you feel small," Hannah said, not a question. "In front of patients. In front of colleagues. Making you question whether you belong here." The nurse nodded, eyes widening slightly. Hannah stood and moved to the wall behind her desk, where her Master Chief insignia hung beside her commissioned officer credentials, her medals in shadow boxes, and beneath them a plaque with words she had engraved the week she arrived: "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." "Come in," Hannah said. "Sit down. Let me tell you what happens when you stand your ground. Let me tell you about a woman who got shot 5 times, and then came back and changed everything." The nurse sat, and Hannah began to speak in a voice that carried no uncertainty, no apology, no whisper of the person she had pretended to be. The voice of someone who had held ground through the worst that violence could offer, and would spend the rest of her career making sure no one else had to hide who they really were. The challenge coin caught the afternoon light in its glass case like a beacon, and outside the office windows, San Antonio sprawled in the heat of late summer, a city that had no idea it was standing next to a legend who wasn't invisible anymore. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe and share Hannah's story of courage and integrity. Let us know in the comments, when did you finally stand your ground?